Hello and welcome to another Capital Record podcast, this time with a repeat guest. I am very excited to bring back my friend Kevin Hassett, who himself is a part of National Review Capital Matters. And gosh, Kevin, you were the first guest ever on Capital Record.
I think that's right. And I'm pretty sure that you went right to seventh place on the Apple podcast list, right?
Yeah, we climbed quite quickly. You're right. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, we haven't been able to move any higher ever since. So we maybe by bringing you on, we'll have another big move up in the ratings.
We'll give it a shot.
Kevin and I were together last week. The day my episode with Larry Kudlow aired, he and I were actually with Larry Kudlow, both of us appearing on Larry's Fox Business Show live from the Reagan Library in Southern California. And then that night enjoying the National Review Gala where Mr. Kudlow received the William F. Buckley Prize. And Kevin and I got to spend an evening visiting with old friends, new friends, and other fellow champions of liberty. And a champion of liberty is what Kevin is, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration and longtime economic influence on me. So, Kevin, welcome back to Capital Record.
Oh, it's really great to be back and great to see how well your podcast is doing. I guess we always knew that would happen, but yeah, it's great to see you have so much success.
Well, thank you for that. And of course, since we started Capital Record, we were kind of right in the midst of a transition, a handoff of an economic team in the Trump administration, included guys like yourself, Larry at NEC, Secretary Mnuchin. We had people like Rick Perry that were in energy. And so you were on the podcast, and then the Biden administration turned things over, and we have a whole new team, new Treasury Secretary, new NEC, CEA, energy, and here we are. How has that transition gone?
You know, it's hard to imagine that the economic team in the Biden administration is having much influence on their policies, and so you know, there's a long tradition, by the way, of CEA chairs respecting and supporting each other. And, you know, when I was CEA chair, you know, so some of the former CEA people were treated me pretty harshly, but I always thought that was unethical. And so I'm not going to say a bad thing about anybody there. But the fact is that Biden policies haven't made a lot of sense to me. And so my guess is that the sage advice of some of the excellent economists they have on their team is being ignored for whatever reason.
Well, and it seems too, and by the way, that answer you give about your CEA colleague and predecessor and successors and whatnot is very similar to the way Larry talks about Brian Deese at NEC. It's not an issue of trying to bad talk colleagues, but we're looking at the policies, looking at what the administration is doing. And it does seem to me that they're maybe not just ignoring in the Biden administration some of their own economic team, but even some of the economic team that is highly regarded in the kind of neo-Keynesian liberal sphere from both Clinton and Obama administrations. There seems to be a rather high-profile rift right now between Larry Summers, Jason Furman, and the present administration. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's right. And I would agree with Larry. You mentioned Brian Deese, and, you know, I know Brian. You know, he talks to me. I think he's a good person. And I don't think he's responsible for, you know, the things that we're seeing. But, you know, the fact is that, as you and I have talked about, I think before, if you attack supply with heavy regulation and tax increases, and then feed demand by mailing checks to people and subsidizing things like putting solar panels on your roofs or whatever, that those two policies tend to feed inflation. And if you add to that, say, the student loan forgiveness, which is a profoundly unconstitutional move, we could talk more about that, then you can see that it's almost as if AOC is the president. And Joe Biden came in and he basically criticized President Trump for being divisive, talked about how we all need to be moderate and work together, and he's basically to the left of any president I ever in the U.S. as far as I could tell. And to put it in perspective, David, the most heavily regulatory president on record prior to Joe Biden was Barack Obama. And when Joe Biden took office, one of his first executive orders was that he said that the regulatory agencies could pass whatever regulations they wanted, and they no longer had to pass a cost benefit test. And so you didn't have to show that a regulation had benefits that exceeded the cost in order to enact it. And subsequently, the Biden administration has introduced new regulations at a rate that's double that of the previous record holder, Barack Obama. And it's no surprise that small business sentiment is about the lowest it's been since World War II, because they're the ones that bear the brunt of all of that cost. And so circling back, to the economic team, for me, the previous rule in a White House was that the Council of Economic Advisors or the Office of Management and Budget had to give a cost-benefit analysis, or what they call an economy and efficiency statement, before a new regulation could be enacted. And this was true under Democrats and Republicans. And the fact is that that the EPA couldn't enact a new regulation without review by OMB or by CEA gave us an enormous amount of authority and power over the different agencies, right? But the minute that Biden issued an executive order basically saying, okay, agencies, you can introduce whatever you want, and it's not subject to review at the White House, he basically, jettisoned the power that people like the CEA chair have over bad economic policies. And if I were there, I would have protested vehemently, not just because of the cost-benefit rule making sense, but because it would have made me ineffective, because they no longer care what I think. And so that's the kind of thing that makes me feel like the economic team is, that there are some good people there with good training, and that they're just not being consulted. That it's the agencies run amok.
And I agree with you, Kevin. And I think, and I also agree with the sort of professional, traditions about not bad talking colleagues and former people in the same position. I think there's a civility to the approach guys like yourself and Larry take. But I do think maybe some of it we should distinguish between staff, cabinet, agencies, positions that are more advisory, the CEA and the NEC. They play a role in policy and advice, but it's different than a cabinet position. Janet Yellen, for example, as Treasury Secretary, it would be hard for me to make the case that she is advocating for a minimum global corporate tax against her own will. She seems to be a true believer in that, I think, ill-advised policy aspiration. Is that a fair distinction?
I'm sure that Janet, as an example, believes in the global minimum tax. I think that she's mistaken to do so, and we could talk about the substance of that. But it is the case that there's a heck of a lot of false information coming out of the mouth of the president. And, an example that you've heard over and over is that he inherited an economy that was in collapse. He even recently said that there were bread lines when he took over, and he engineered the most remarkable economic turnaround ever. And the fact is that we had engineered the recovery from the COVID shutdowns. GDP growth in the fourth quarter, the first quarter was around 6%, while inflation was around 1%. And so this idea that the economy was reeling and he came in with his brilliant policies and turned it around is exactly backwards. The economy was healed, and he came in with his reckless policies and turned it around by making it a lot worse. We've had 2 negative quarters in a row, and we've got runaway inflation. And so it's one thing to sort of try to find something to point to that's fact-based, to argue that your administration is doing a good job. Every politician does that. And if you're working for a politician, I would guess that when Larry Kudlow was at NEC and I was at CEA, there were times when there were some bad numbers that we didn't like to talk about, right? And good numbers that we did like to talk about. That's part of the job for sure if you're at the political sphere. But there's basically a staff secretary process where if the president says something, then all the different principals, like the CEA chair and the Treasury secretary, are supposed to review it and make sure that it's factually correct. And the fact that Biden is out there, pitching falsehoods every time he talks about the economy suggests that the staff process is broken, or that people have stopped trying for whatever reason. But for me, I would say that the level of falsehood coming out of Biden's mouth, the extent to which almost everything he says about the economy is just a blatant falsehood. I guess that if I were there, I would have to resign. It would be dishonorable to have someone out there saying the kind of things that he's saying about turning the economy around. There being bread lines when he's there, and he's saying false things about the numbers. And your job at CEA is to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I honestly really think that if President Trump had taken like my corner of like what's in the speech and said such blatantly false things over and over, I would have resigned. And my guess is that what's going to happen is after the election, you're going to see a lot of resignations, would be my guess. Yeah, because resignation is kind of an interesting thing. You become the news story, and so you kind of want to do it quietly. But my guess is that there's going to be like a abandoning of ship, regardless of how the midterm turns out. That's unprecedented because if you're an honorable person, you can't stand by and let them lie about your area the way he is.
Well, it's a great point, and I think there's a certain tolerance we all have for spin, right? For political kind of tweaking and twisting and whatnot, and I have tried to be as gracious and realistic about all these things as I can be, and I also candidly am aware of where certain hyperbole could come from the former president, your boss as well on occasion. And yet this is different. I mean, categorically, this notion about breadlines, about the worst economy, there is a sense in which it gets beyond politicking and actually impacts economic policy. If you're running a campaign commercial and you're saying, I took something bad and it wasn't really that bad, and I made it great and it wasn't really that good, that's, I guess, just going to be up to voters to decide what they believe. But when you're implementing policy, because you say things were really like X and they weren't like X. And that's kind of the heart of the matter of that March of 2021, quote unquote, stimulus bill, the kind of third behemoth of a spending package that included that final $2,000 direct payment. It extended unemployment benefits. You and I have disagreed a little bit on this issue, but we agree at the heart of the matter that whether one thinks it was money being given that stimulated demand or labor being incentivized not to return that hurt supply, or I think your argument, Kevin, is a bit of both. Either way, there's no dispute that those things were inflationary, and that the lack of incentive to return to work that was extended by the Biden administration was a disaster. And I don't mean that just in CPI. I mean it to the soul of the nation. The idea of having to see signs up all over the place of employers begging people to come back to work, I think it is a totally un-American idea economically. And it seems to me that what you're saying is exactly right, that because he was getting away with claiming that they inherited such a disaster. In fact, even though it was really well on its way to a post-COVID recovery, not to mention the administration was going to get the tailwind of the vaccine and certain elements of COVID normalization, it seems to me that there's just no excuse for what was allowed to take place in 2021 from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, and think about it too in terms of like going back to the way things are being discussed and the free pass that they get from the media. I honestly am disgusted by when we were in the White House, we would say true things and get 4 Pinocchios. and these guys are saying false things every day, and nobody in this sort of liberal fact-checking constellation is stepping up and saying something about it. But take this, for example. They're bragging now about deficit reduction, saying they're the biggest deficit reducers ever. The Inflation Reduction Act was going to reduce inflation, right? Because it reduced the deficit if you believe the tax hikes were going to raise the revenue that they say, and if you believe all those IRS agents are going to make so much money from the audits of everybody that they're going to raise revenue. But it was like a couple $100 billion. But then they right after that did the student loan forgiveness, which the Wharton model tells us is going to cost $1 trillion. And so if you within a couple of weeks of each other have a bill that reduces the deficit by 200 billion over 10, and then one that adds to the deficit by $1 trillion over 10, then you shouldn't be allowed to brag about deficit reduction, right? Because on net you're down 800 billion. I'm sorry, and so this is just the kind of bizarre Kafkaesque place that this administration has taken the economic conversation, and I think that it's. But
isn't there something even worse, though, Kevin? That even apart from the reality, the numbers you're pointing out, and the gamesmanship that has to take place to get there, the other piece is that Build Back Better was cut off despite their wishes by one of their own colleagues in the Senate. Maybe you can give Sinema credit too. So one or two Democratic senators killed that deficit from blowing out that their no bragging didn't blow out. So there's almost two levels of extraordinary dishonesty.
It's exactly right. It's exactly right. And then don't forget that the thing that is leading to deficit reduction relative to 2020 and 2021 is the end of the massive COVID relief, which was always designed to be temporary. And so if you look at the Congressional Budget Office forecast for what would happen this year, and then if you look at what actually happened, then the deficit has gone up enormously. And so the idea that you would, relative to baseline, the deficit's worse, and yet they're bragging about deficit reduction, and that's being covered as factual on the evening news. It makes me just wonder, what kind of a country are we becoming? And frankly, I think it's time for journalism schools like the Columbia School of Journalism to step up and just say, now, wait a minute, you guys have become propagandists for the Democrats. This is not what journalism is. You're destroying our profession. The journalists are now the least respected least respected profession out there, below used car salesmen and congressmen, right? And it's because they're allowing the worst things to happen in Washington and not talking about it. But then when a Republican, I'll give you a specific example, David, that one of the things that Scott Gottlieb did when he got to FDA, and he and I talked a lot about this when we first got into the White House, was that the FDA was slow rolling the approval of generic drugs. And they sometimes would approve the first generic, but then if you have two companies selling a drug, then they act almost like a monopoly, right? It's a duopoly. And so they still have a high price. And so what Scott did is the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh company that applied to sell a generic drug, they got approved rapidly under Scott Gottlieb. There were more generic drugs approved in his first year than had ever been approached in previous years. Well, anyway, so what happened was, because of all those generics, for the first time since World War II, the consumer price index for drugs in the U.S. declined. It actually did it 2 years in a row. And when we talked about it, the Washington Post gave us Pinocchios. Even though the consumer price index actually had declined, and so at the point where when we say true things and they're like that, the CPI actually really did decline, and it is the gold standard measure. And then Biden can come out and say the stuff that he's saying, and no one holds him to account. It just makes you feel like, I would rather be in the Soviet Union trying to trick TASS into covering me honestly than try to get the Washington Post to cover a Republican honestly right now. And it's something that if you're a journalist at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, you should be ashamed of the organization that you work for. You are not a defender of democracy. There is no darkness that's being exposed by you. You're covering up darkness, and it's shameful.
Well, I agree entirely. And it's one of the reasons, Kevin, I think that honesty and integrity have to be maintained by our side in all opportunities so that we maintain a moral high ground and are in the right authoritative position to call them out on this. This deficit reduction thing you bring up, this isn't the first time. The Obama administration, look, the deficits came down from over $1 trillion to under 500 billion in the latter years of Obama's second term. And that's essentially a true mathematical fact. And the Obama administration would brag about it like crazy and never mention that the only reason those deficits came down was because the Republicans forced the sequester in the 2011 budget debates that the Obama administration fought tooth and nail, but had lost control of the House, and Boehner held his House together. And the Senate eventually appointed that committee that was going to try to come up with an extension and wasn't able to. And so the sequester went into effect and spending came way down, particularly discretionary. There were also some military spending cuts that some people didn't like and whatnot. But my point was to then go run a commercial about how much you brought the deficit down when it happened despite you, not because of you. This seems to be a new political reality. And I've now seen the Biden administration do it and the Obama administration do it. And as you point out, with no media accountability.
Right. And I think that places like National Review and Fox News and the Wall Street Journal are places that you can rely upon to get the facts straight. And you can see if you look just to praise in part a competitor of ours, David. The Wall Street Journal is pretty rough on Donald Trump at times, right? And as is National Review, and so it's almost like a test that you should if you're going to go consume media. A test should be: did they actually wallop people on both sides? And if they do, then it's a source that you might potentially be able to trust. But like honest to goodness, I can't tell you how many times I've had friends of mine from the Trump administration saying, what the heck are you doing at National Review? They're so anti-Trump. But of course, we're not anti-Trump at National Review. We're just truth seekers, and we have lots of different smart people who disagree with one another about issues, right? Like so we have knocked down, drag out fights at National Review over stuff. And I'm probably the person that likes President Trump the most. And there are a lot of people who disagree with me on that, but we all enjoy smoking cigars together, right? And the fact is that there's just nobody. I mean, remember Jennifer Rubin is supposedly the Republican at the Washington Post, right?
Yeah, hopefully we're kind of past that phase of it. I actually don't pay her any attention anymore at all. I was just distraught to see where she had gone and what she had done with her own integrity 5 or 6 years ago. And at this point now, I have a hard time taking her seriously at all. Well, so Kevin, let me ask you in a few minutes we have left here. Do you think there are things in that spirit of kind of objectivity in the political moment, truth seeking, and cordial disagreement in certain things? I felt that that President Trump saying that Powell should be doing more quantitative easing, and that the dollar was too strong, and that interest rates needed. I thought he took in the middle of his term a posture rhetorically on monetary policy that was counterproductive. And then, of course, the COVID moment happened and a lot of things became very, very different. And my big criticism of Jay Powell is not that I think the Fed funds rate or QE, for that matter, caused inflation. I think it did exacerbate dramatically housing inflation, which ironically is the huge part right now, along with food, that is a political inconvenience for the White House, as certain parts of the economy experience the inevitability of disinflation. They're not getting any favors yet from rent prices and housing prices in the way it comes through in CPI. But anyways, my point being, monetary policy seems to me to be this element where both sides of the aisle can get away with saying things that aren't accurate because no one really understands it that well, and they can sort of take for granted are you at all, as an objective and intellectually honest economist, are you worried that we are at a point of monetary policy where you want easy policy if a Republican is in office and you're a Republican, and you want tight policy if a Democrat's in office and you're a Democrat? In other words, booms and bust are okay as long as the booms come when your guy's there and the busts come when the other guy's there. Do you think I'm overstating the concern here?
No, it's a legitimate concern. And if you go back and look, one of the things that got Trump going on the Fed was that the Fed basically started tightening the minute he took office, right? The minute he was elected. And Janet Yellen sure did look like a partisan Democrat, and she looks, more so perhaps now as Treasury Secretary, but that's her job now. Back then it wasn't. But he felt there was political timing to the hiking cycle, and that they were trying to harm the economy because there were so many Democrats at the Fed that didn't like him. I think that the good news is, I know most of the people at the Fed. I was at the Jackson Hole conference, and there are a heck of a lot of old-fashioned people that understand that independent central banks are important for the health of a free market economy, and they're going to be independent. Jay Powell mentioned they were about to go through some pain to fight inflation. And I think what that means is when the unemployment rate goes up, he's not going to cave and start reducing rates. He's just going to do the right thing. But I want to finish by telling you a sort of funny story about jawboning the Fed. President Trump did jawbone the Fed a lot, and he even opined, I forget whether it was direct or if it was just covered in the news, but you'll remember about whether he might fire Jay Powell. I don't know if you remember that there was talk about that.
I do, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so it was something that I actually that know a lot of people that have studied the law around the Fed, because I worked at the Fed and I'm an economist that studied the Fed for my whole life, and basically with White House counsel and with reference to the Federal Reserve Act, basically it became clear that he didn't have the authority to fire the Fed chair. What he could do is he could fire Jay Powell as Fed chair, but he couldn't fire him as a governor. It's just it's a weird thing. And it's one reason why people think the Fed's actually unconstitutional, because the president explicitly doesn't have the authority to fire governors. And so what would have happened is he said, I'm firing Jay Powell as chairman, but then at every meeting, the governors could all vote to make him the chair of the meeting. Right. And so it's just pointless, but you couldn't fire him as a governor. And so I had this meeting in the Oval with him where we said, well, you've been talking about whether we could do this, and just FYI, you don't have the legal authority to do it. Anyway, so he went off to the Middle East or something after that, and I was doing a TV hit out in Pebble Beach out in front of the White House. And as I was walking back to my office, a bunch of reporters came out, and they call it a gaggle, right? They start asking you questions. And then one reporter asked me, is the president going to fire Jay Powell? And then I said, I didn't reference that we just had a meeting about it in the Oval in the last day or so. But what I said is Jay Powell's job is 100% safe. It's 100% safe. The president's not going to fire Jay Powell. And I was sure that it was correct that I was saying it. And there was no calculus on my part about trying to get out in front of anyone in the White House. It was just it was an established thing. And I thought it was worth telling the guy the truth about it. Well, anyway, the Dow went up about 1,000 points right away because I had just said that we're not going to fire Jay Powell. And at the close of the market, I get a call from Air Force One. It's the president. He says, right after you went on TV, the Dow went up 1,000 points. We need to put you on every day. But I think when he saw that the news that he wasn't going to fire Jay Powell was celebrated by markets, I think he recognized that the independent Fed is a really important thing, and I think other presidents probably discover it in their own way, but I think that if you watch markets, it's actually the most disturbing thing about Joe Biden, right? Is he says he doesn't look at markets.
Yeah,
I think you should look at the stock market every day because it's the best forward-looking indicator there is.
Yeah, that it would be worse if I believed it. I don't, but you're right that he would even say it indicates an economic ignorance rather than owning the fact that forward indicators are good, price discovery is good, sentiment is good. I don't think Barack Obama would have said that, and I know Bill Clinton wouldn't have said it. Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, Alan Greenspan, they wouldn't have said something like that.
Right. Right.
Well, Kevin, I really appreciate you coming on and talk to us. I think that your pleadings for media honesty are incredibly important. I think that the need for accurate information coming from our nation's economic counselors and advisors is very important. And maybe we'll just do our best to use this podcast to portray accurate information. I continue to be such an admirer of your work, and I hope you'll come back and talk with us again.
Of course. And the other thing you do so well, David, that I just want to finish with is that when people who have the responsibility to inform the public, like Larry Summers and Jason Furman, break from their political pack and stick to the facts, then we need to acknowledge that and praise it. And hope that we can be that strong ourselves when we're having to criticize people that we generally support politically.
I think that's exactly right. And it's funny, that's actually cut both ways for me, because there's areas where I'm really complimentary of Summers and Furman on certain things. And yet I also seen folks on the right that because they were worrying about inflation and the Biden administration was in a rift with them, and then inflation went up, that now they might be looking too much to guys like Summers and Furman and forgetting where there are legitimate disagreements. For example, Larry is so critical of supply side tax cuts as a way of spurring economic growth. It's just necessary for us to maintain our integrity, to call balls and strikes. And it cuts both ways. It cuts both ways with our own people. You probably wouldn't agree with me about everything. I think you and I would agree with each other about most things, but not all. And I know I'll say this about you. I think your advocacy of a free and consistent view of exchange and wanting to limit and be contextualized, and where tariffs would be a good idea, not a good idea, as it pertains to working through the trade complexities that the Trump administration tackled. I think that was a great example of what you're talking about, of being willing to, say both sides of an issue, take on some popular view or unpopular view, but go towards the right place. And I think we just got to keep doing more of that, Kevin.
Yeah, and that's why your podcast is doing so well. So a lot of people agree with that.
Well, thanks so much, and we'll have you back on soon. Well, I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Kevin. He is one of the best, very, very bright guy. We had a great time last week at that event we were talking about, and you hear from him the passion he has for economic truth telling. It's what he does. He, there's stories, I guess, kind of inside baseball I probably shouldn't share, but look, he's willing to stake out unpopular opinions, even with folks that are, were within administration. And I commend him for it. And I hope that our view of the current economy will continue to be based on objective economic truth telling, not political aspiration, distorting facts, ignoring facts, rooting for things you wouldn't otherwise root for out of the politics of the moment. It's not the stuff I want to do in my life. It's not the stuff I believe in. It's not the stuff I want for Capitol Record. And it's not the stuff National Review believes in. And in the case of guys like Kevin Hassett, Larry Kudlow, you're talking about people at the inside senior levels of policymaking in a presidential administration. And it's not what they're about either. So we're going to continue doing these two things that both come back to the belief in a free and virtuous society. And that is try to get economic policy and theory right, and do so with integrity and honesty. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for listening. Please rate us, rank us, subscribe, and tell a friend about the Capitol Record podcast as we continue trying to climb the ratings to make this podcast message known far and wide. Thanks for listening to Capitol Record.